how grandparents and their grandchildren can have meaningful relationships, meaningful supportive relationships in the context of the COVID era. And I think, as you'll see from our panelists and from hearing Geoff and I, that we think there's a lot of different ways that that can happen, and a lot of meaningful ways that that can happen, and a lot of ways that can happen that support both a child's academic and individual growth, and that they can support their Jewish moral and ethical growth, and that those things probably are really compatible, as one of the things you'll hopefully hear from me. So today I'm going to be, Geoff is going to be presenting a little bit with a sort of psychological background, and giving you a little context for the sort of theory around grandparenting. And I'm going to talk a little bit about schools, schooling, and sort of broadly what I might think of the role of many of the roles that grandparents could play very broadly in education. So before we do any of that, oh, and then we're going to hear from a panel, sorry. And our panelists I will introduce when we get closer to that moment, but we have 4 grandparents here to talk to you. And we're really excited to hear from them. And they're each going to share about their very different, diverse experiences, both being grandparents and being Jewish grandparents. And we're of course going to give you several opportunities to have discourse and discussion and ask questions as you see fit at various points during the presentation. And I sort of mapped out the agenda here. Oh, am I not sharing yet? Let me share. I forgot to share again. So you can see, I've been looking at this presentation myself, but here's an agenda. This is the introductions part. We're a little over, 1 minute over. How many folks here have grandchildren? So if you can see grid view, hopefully you can see some show of hands. I'm seeing most people, yeah, the overwhelming majority. I do not have my own grandchildren. If you want to throw it in the chat also, I think one of the most effective ways to communicate, if you are not a presenter today, is to just throw questions, comments, thoughts you have in the chat. And then Candace, who's going to serve as our tech angel today, can help pull those out of the chat, ask you at various points to come off mute, to share your questions, or just read those questions out. We'll do what seems feasible as we go. So yeah, I think we'll get us started. We're going to talk a little bit about understanding grandparenting from a Jewish and secular theory perspective, and I'm going to turn it over to Geoff in 1 second. Then I'm going to talk about grandparents, parents, children, and schooling. We're going to have some time to talk. Then we'll do our panel, have some more time to talk. And we'll wrap up in about an hour, hopefully, but we will have some open time after that if folks want to stay on it. All right. Geoff, without further ado.
Great. Thank you.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I forgot something important, Geoff. Before we begin, if folks wouldn't mind, feel free to come off mute, and we can say the blessing for the studying of the Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Asher
kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'asak divrei Torah.
All right. Awesome.
Amen.
Thank you. Amen.
So thanks, Gabe, and welcome everyone. I'm really happy to be here today, and thank you, Malka, and all the others who really worked to bring this this discussion to life. I'm Geoff Neimark. I am a psychiatrist by training. I have a private practice, also work for part of the UPMC system, and I am not a grandparent. So that's a giant caveat that I'll give you at the beginning. And I like to always say that practice trumps theory every time. So take what say with that advice. But what I was hoping we could do in the 10 minutes that we sort of have is just do kind of a whirlwind tour of what I'm calling grandparental theory. It's really going to be a brief survey of the social science literature, anthropology and sociology and psychology, and then we're going to be taking a look into Jewish insights into grandparenting, and sort of thinking about the secular versus the religious. And again, not to caveat too much, but any 7.5 minute foray into this is necessarily incomplete. So we're going to do what we can. But, after anyone who's interested at the conclusion of this, I'm happy to complete your certificate of auditing, Grandparenting 101. So just a few sort of background facts on this that I think are important to go over. One is that really the world we're living in is changing. People are living longer. It's been called the gray dawn, if you will, but certainly a higher number of folks are living into older age, and simultaneously, families are having fewer children. So it's creating some interesting opportunities and overlaps. I came across a Danish study that looked at the amount of time that grandparents and grandchildren spent together from 1850 to now, and it really went from something like 4 overlap years to around 20. There have also been some pretty big changes in family structure. We've moved away from really that 1950s nuclear family model. There's all sorts of constellations. Single parenthood is common. Divorce rate it's actually went up, but is sort of plateaued at a fairly high level. And working patterns have changed, and in particular, women's role in the workforce has changed in the past half century. And I'll add a little more just nuance. There's such really large fluctuation in what grandparenting looks like around the world. There's a Chinese urbanization phenomena where there have been 60 million what are called left behind children who are being raised in smaller villages by their grandparents. Think about Philippines or other cultures and countries where folks are actually looking for work opportunities and will sometimes work abroad for long periods. And, interesting things even in Northern Europe versus sort of the continent where there are robust sort of social systems that provide childcare, the amount of time spent with grandparents is far less. And I'd submit, we don't have to look halfway around the world to find how heterogeneous grandparenting can really look. If you look in Philadelphia, there are tremendously different patterns of what that relationship might look like. Going to move into grandparenting theories. Quickly, the grandmother, and these are theories, so take them with a grain of salt. There's this grandmother hypothesis, which has been controversial. It posits that menopause came about to allow a shift of resources and survival benefit onto the next generation. There's some self-interest theory. This is really sort of a selfish evolution notion that people invest resources in things that ultimately will pay dividends, so your children will take care of you or when you're older. And then there's just a survival benefit theory of folks who have been around for a while might know how to do things, which there certainly is a large amount of truth to that. But it is interesting because I'll point out also that if you look in mammalian species, grandparenting outside maybe elephants and whales is probably the exception, not the rule, to have grandparents really be active. So sharing this, that there are different sorts of or patterns of involvement. There's what's been called the non-resident grandparent. So, you might come over and babysit the kids, or they might come over there, or you take them to school. There's a co-resident grandparent who's living in a parent or other maintained household. There's a grandparent maintained household, not necessarily custodial. And then there's the last category of custodial, where really legally a grandparent has custody of children. And I will say, I looked at some data. There was a great something put forward by the AARP that really gave a great breakdown of all these different styles. But the 2012 census data showed that 10% of all Americans live with a grandparent. And I suspect actually that that number probably went up. And aside from that sort of structure, the form of involvement varies widely. And so I just shared just a few data points of how it looks different in different places. Europe, South Korea, and clearly it varies both geographically, but also developmentally, both the age of the grandchild and the grandparent. A few contributions from the sociological literature about grandparenting. Some of the thoughts that really, or themes are really being there is important, providing resources as needed, non-interference, so not undermining primary parental roles, but working together. And there's some interesting data around grandmothering versus grandfathering. A lot of the data really suggests that the maternal grandmothers tend to be, maternal parents in general, that is, tend to be much more involved. So there are distinctions there as well. Going to jump into some, again, whirlwind to our sort of the psychological perspectives. And I broke this down into 4 big categories, but the Freudian perspective really, this is, Sigmund Freud's theory. It was really heavily Oedipal and heavily competitive and really focused, I think, disproportionately on parent-child and particular father relationships, often at the extent, I think, of grandparental and sibling relationships. And so the contributions from that literature are not so great and tend to fall into a sort of more competitive or alliedship place. Object relations, I think, is a really nice, does some nice work with this, and it really talks about the ways in which we internalize our relationships, and they become part of our sort of psyche and psychic structure and help sustain, nourish, and inform ourself and our relationships to the world. And when you think about that, it's really quite, you call upon these sorts of things of your loving grandmother, and it can really kind of stick with you and help you in trying times. Family systems really looks at the structures, and that really gets into some of the other stuff we talked about, which is, undermining parents and the roles and responsibilities, and particularly the boundary crossings in there that can be challenging. And then the Ericksonian developmental really just looks at each stage of life as needing to accomplish some key tasks. And for grandparents, it might be sort of being generative or feeling they've accomplished what they wanted to accomplish. And often grandparenting functions can help fulfill those. Going to quickly talk about outcomes. I'd say there's there's a wide fluctuation. The meta-analyses, all sorts of look. Overall, they're good. They really help most with some mental health outcomes. There's some suggestive data even on mortality. It's not particularly strong, but there are also positive academic, psychological, and social developmental impacts that are felt on grandchildren. And really close grandparental relationships can buttress things like divorce or death, adverse events that folks might encounter. I'd say that the takeaway here is really good relationships are good and help. So that's the secular world. I'm going to quickly do grandparenting, the Jewish perspective. So talk a little about the Torah. In Genesis, we see that Joseph, when he's gathering his children, Jacob, when he's gathering his children, says to Joseph, notices that actually it's his grandchildren that are there, and he blesses his grandchildren and says, "May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh." And that is actually the blessing we say it every Shabbat at our services, and traditionally Jewish parents say this to their children. But it's interesting that a blessing, a grandparental blessing, is the one that we use to bless our children with. And I think there have been a lot of questions as to why that might be. There's some talk about this having to do with the fact that Ephraim and Manasseh are the first children born in Galut, in exile, and so they need a blessing. I actually think that the reason that this is there is that the true blessing is the transmission of the spiritual inheritance, which really occurs across generations and which consists of the work done many years before us. Sort of like the fruit of a fruit tree that we plant, but we may never harvest. And it really constitutes, I think, some of the beauty of concepts like Lador Vador, from generation to generation. Maybe we'll go into the Talmud, the next one, this story. And I'm going to read these out because I think this is just so beautiful. Rabbi Joshua ben Levi said, "Whoever teaches his grandson Torah is regarded as if he had received the Torah from Mount Sinai. As it is said, teach your children and children's children." And then it says, the day you stood before your God at Horeb. And then, and I want to point out that the first version is from the Babylonian Talmud. The second one is from the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. The second one says, Rabbi Joshua ben Levi used to listen every Friday to his grandson reciting the weekly Parsha. One week he forgot this, and he entered the bathhouse, and after he started bathing, he remembered he had not yet heard the weekly Parsha from his grandson, and he left the bathhouse. They asked him why he was leaving in the middle of his bathing, since the Mishnah teaches that once you have begun bathing on a Friday afternoon, you do not have to interrupt. He replied, "Is this such a small thing in your eyes? For whoever hears the Parsha from his grandchild, it is as if he heard it directly from Mount Sinai." And I want to share just something. This is not mine. This is Rabbi Cook's interpretation, but it's really beautiful. According to the Bavli, the greatest privilege is to teach your grandchildren Torah. According to the Yerushalmi, the Talmud, the greatest privilege is to have your grandchild teach Torah to you. This is one argument about which no grandparent will have the slightest difficulty in saying that both are true. And I think it's really that bidirectionality and the appreciation of its magical awesomeness to me, and what transpires between grandparent and grandchild really is so much of the essence of grandparenting. So the next slide is really just some Jewish tidbits. There's this Jewish Grandparenting Network that was started some years back. It's done some interesting work on sort of surveying demographics. And you can see they categorized sort of different styles of transmission, and the percentages are up there. I'm not going to, probably over time already, but I think I'll just say this, from a Jewish perspective, I just think that relationship is just so special. It's a parent, but it's not a parent. And in that way, it's sort of holy and set apart. It's sanctified. And I think the relationship with grandparents really connects us over time and really brings us back to our origin stories. One of the stories I learned when I was doing some more intense Jewish learning is that sometimes, in distinction to the secular world, Jews view each generation before them as having been closer to Sinai and closer to the source, and in some ways having much more wisdom in that respect. I think that at times stands in contrast to how we tend to think that every generation sort of moves forward and advances and is smarter and wiser and more learned in ways that I think are not necessarily represented in our tradition. So I will end with this grandparenting slide, that it's certainly heterogeneous, certainly different experiences and models. Healthy relationships are good for all involved. It's really increasingly important and necessary from a functional perspective. And it necessarily needs to evolve. I like to say it's not your grandfather's grandfather. We're in a different time, and one size does not fit all. The modalities are changing. You might be going to shul together on Zoom or chatting or doing whatever it is. But I think in our society where questions of identity and meaning just have more and more increasing valence. It's just a potent, such a potent source of that, and of value transmission, and of so much else that is good. So I know that was a very quick tour, a lot of information. I apologize if it was too much, but tried to squeeze it all in there, and I will stop with that.
Thank you so much, Geoff. And I learned a huge amount, so I appreciate it. I told Geoff I'm the father of a professor of developmental psychology and education. So I felt very, very much like this was going to be, I was going to be at home in this presentation, but I learned a lot. So I'm Gabriel Kuriloff. I am the backup emergency principal at Science Leadership Academy at Bieber. Basically the assistant principal at Science Leadership Academy at Bieber, which is in sort of the deep West Philadelphia, on basically almost on City Line Avenue. We are a non-traditional magnet school that is in the family of Science Leadership Academies that live, the founding of which is the school that's at Benjamin Franklin, which you may have heard about, that's sharing a building with Benjamin Franklin High School, which you may have heard a lot about on the news last year, or in an ongoing way, unfortunately. But we are a family of progressive schools that are sort of oriented around project-based learning and around the inquiry method, around sort of the scientific method as a fundamental way of learning. So student-centered, holistic, child-centered schools. And we're part of a national group of schools that do similar work, some of which are operating all over the city. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that, but in the name of time, I'm going to give a very brief history, the abridged version of American schooling. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about, I talked to a bunch of principals over the last couple of weeks, and I asked them what they thought I should tell you, because I, like Geoff, am not a grandparent, although I work with several and had my own, and love them very much. So I want to talk a little bit about what we think the most important determinants of educational outcomes are. So what you are really doing if you want to help your child succeed in school or grandchild succeed in school. And then I'll sort of pick up from there. So very quickly, American public schooling began with the theory that A, we needed to warehouse immigrants and we needed to teach them to be American, and B, that people could be taught, like pigeons could be taught to play ping pong by giving them a successive series of treats. That similarly, we kind of program people to be automatons, and if we sat them in rows and we gave them the right inputs and the right reward system, they would come out the other side as well-mannered, voting, civically minded Americans. And over the years, that developed enormously from a very sort of basic set of expectations to the point where schools were asked to be responsible for sexual education and physical education and spiritual education in some cases, certainly moral and ethical education, responsible for career and technical education, and responsible for feeding children, as we have seen highlighted in the COVID crisis. And under these burdens, schools have lagged enormously over the last 100 years. And trying to do all of them has been a real challenge. And so I think it's fair to say that the village really does raise the child, and that it is a lot more than a public or private or really good Jewish school that makes a whole child. And this, of course, was true before there were schools. Families raise children, communities raise children. I don't really believe it's that different today. And I think the data strongly supports this. The greatest predictors, true greatest predictors of educational success are socioeconomic status. Our language, the number of words spoken in the home from childhood. These are the great predictors. Families with means that can take children to museums and to the orchestra, these children have an enormous advantage in our academic system. And that's not just, and a lot of it has to do with what we measure. And one of the things I'm going to pitch today to grandparents particularly is that we can do a whole lot of good, not worrying about the things that school is asking us to worry about, but worrying about all the many other important things that make a whole well-rounded, unique, powerful, creative, happy, optimistic child. And so I don't remember the name of this philosopher. I was taught this quote by the principal, the founding principal of a school that sits on Mount Olive overlooking the Mediterranean just outside of Haifa, a school called Yemen Ord, and its founder told me the most important thing for a child is a coherent worldview. And this is an orphanage, Yemen Ord, and they take children from, 50 nations around the world, and sometimes they show up with, nothing but a suitcase sent by a village to be schooled in Israel. And they're enormously successful. It takes a long time to heal the children, but enormously successful. And one of the things Chaim Perry says is that what we give them is a coherent worldview, more than anything else. We give them a sense that they can be okay in this world, that they can move effectively, that they can make a decision and advocate. And these things really are the most important things for successful childhood. So the things we know about schooling since we thought that pigeons could be trained include learning is profoundly social, that meaning making only is made in a social context. So we only make meaning as people in relation to what other people think. So discourse and dialogue, the things that have been profoundly important in Jewish tradition for thousands of years, really do matter profoundly for the development of knowledge. Learning is also not linear. So one of the real challenges with school is that we try to put children's learning in the same boxes. And it's not real, and that's just not how people are. We don't grow at the same thing. We aren't interested in the same things at the same time. So one of the things I've been doing for my friends is just blessing their parental decisions. Follow the needs of your child. Do not do what the school tells you. Get good grades, but do not do other things. Do not stress. Relax, take deep breaths, and do what you think is best for your child. Take care of your child. So again, I said my expertise is really in project-based learning. I am maybe going to get killed by an army of other educators, some of which are going to be panelists today, when I say schools are not the only or best vehicles for learning. But it's really true. I think most of us do not think of our classrooms when we think of the most important educative experiences we've had in our lives. And if we do think of our classrooms, we think of very small pieces of them, experiences, really rich experiences we had in those classrooms. So these things matter. Having language and being able to use it, being literate and being able to read and being interested in reading, being flexible, adaptive, being creative, being able to solve problems, being able to organize things, including nowadays digital organization, grit and stick-to-itiveness, being able to bear with challenging situations and frustration. And most of your grandchildren are getting real lessons in being frustrated right now. So this is something that can definitely be helped, supported, loved on. And of course, interpersonal skills, collaborative skills. I'm missing a comma. Communication skills. Ironically, in my bullet on communication skills, I'm missing a comma. But these also are things that are really things that can be helped with in an engaging, rich, and human way that doesn't have to be about school, and will of course help any child with their school and school. So in hybrid schooling, one of the things I've been really encouraging parents to do is we enrolled our children in these schools. Because of the way the world works, we want them to have good grades. We know there is reward for having good grades. So we want them to sort of work through the boring stuff, and we want to help them do that and help them that be as meaningful as possible without making it stressful, without making it seem like it's the be all and end all, without putting, as I said, the last bullet here, first things not first. We really want to help that with that coherent part is helping first things be first. Like, we're going to help you. My daughter used to do these 100-problem multiplication problems, and they were torturous. And my wife is a professor of math education and does not think these are a useful thing for a child to be doing with her time. But we wanted her to do them because she wanted to do them, and she was accountable for getting them done. So we developed a system where I would sit there and I'd go, and she'd start doing them, and then she'd start to wear down or slow down, and I'd go, go! And then I'd jump up, go! Go! And every time she looked out the window. And it was just, it sounds kind of crazy, but it was a way that we sort of played with having to do this task that was sort of not super meaningful, that I, as an educator, couldn't particularly justify. And I'm super clear with my children, and I don't know that my wife always loves this, about educational tasks I don't think are overly valuable. I try never to minimize a teacher or what a teacher is doing. But I say, you know, sometimes teachers have us do this because some children need to practice this and it's helpful. For you, this may not be the most helpful thing, but we do it because the teacher asked us to do it. And one of the things we practice in school is getting these things done that the teacher asked us to do quickly and easily. So let's figure out a way we can do it quickly and easily together. And then, of course, helping students find joy in every opportunity. This being the great secret to surviving school. My colleague, CJ, and I, Principal Johnson and I, we really believe that the secret to our personal success, and we try to get everybody in the organization to believe that all we are is just unbelievably preposterously optimistic. And if you ask us if you ask him how he's doing, he says between outstanding and excellent every single time, like the guy from Truman Show, you know? So I really believe that's a coherent worldview that you can help inhabit for children who, especially now, may be experiencing a lot of stress and anxiety, especially social stress and anxiety, because they are distant, many of them. Even if they're in school in a hybrid fashion, they can't actually interact with their friends the way they are supposed to. So what can we do? We can add inspiration, meaning, and fun. And we do that in the most human ways, unlike tearing up by taking walks in the park with children. I asked Principal Johnson this like right before I got on the call, what should I tell them? He said, take them for walks in the park as much as possible. We tell our teachers, get them off of Zoom. Anything you can do to not have class, anything you can do to not be on Zoom. Projects, foundational skills. Do they know how to change a tire? Do they want to learn to change a tire? To plant something in the garden, to, you know, there's a million lists online of things every adult should know, many of which are not taught. How to write a letter, you know, calligraphy, you know.
Is that from that list you printed?
Yes, but I'm in the middle of a conference with a whole bunch of grandparents right now in synagogue. That's my lovely daughter, Ruth. She will be a bat mitzvah this upcoming year. I should have made you sit in this presentation. Reading, writing, and reading. These are things that can be done without having anything to do with school that are really profoundly helpful specifically for school. So you reading to your grandchild and modeling what mature reading sounds like while they are reading along, which can be done totally beautifully virtually. Google this. There are videos of grandparents doing this that will tutor you on it, or take my email and send me an email and we will create a video for you on this subject. I'm sure Gail can facilitate that. These things are really doable even if you aren't seeing each other in person right now. Doing projects together, teaching, my father taught my two older kids to whittle. I bought them pocket knives, and online he got out his pocket knife and they whittled together. And then there was sawdust all over my house for weeks, and sharp objects everywhere. Puzzling, problem solving, playing games. I talked to a buddy of mine who's been the principal for years and years and years and is at actually a mastery school. It's very different than my kind of school. But he said, following the child's expertise and sharing your own. Learn to love that thing your grandchild loves, right? If it's Pokemon, you better learn to love Pokemon, is what he said. I don't know anything about Pokemon, for the record, not a thing. It's some kind of card game, I think. But really listening to the grandchild, I noticed that my mother-in-law does this beautifully, not that my mother doesn't, but my mother-in-law was a 45-year Head Start teacher. She does this beautifully. She really hears my children. She spends time listening to them. And then she's able to meet them with these things. So my son loves sports, and my mother-in-law is not the biggest sports fan, I don't think, but she listens to him tell her what happened in last night's baseball game. I'm a baseball fan, and it makes me crazy sometimes because of the way he tells these stories. But she pays attention and then pursues that passion with him. And that is a real way to engage. And then that becomes a bridge to many other things. There's a very famous educator named Gloria Ladson-Billings, who, if you want to read a great educational writer, please, I encourage you, who says, today is another day I won't use the Pythagorean theorem. She has a t-shirt that says that. And listen, I'm an English teacher, but I was very briefly a geometry teacher, and I do love the Pythagorean theorem. But there's no doubt that that's true. This isn't the beginning and ending of life, right? All right, before we actually get to our panel, there should be a slide here that says questions and answers. So Candace, I don't know if people have been putting questions in for Geoff and I, or if folks just want to come off mute one at a time as politely as we can to each other and ask questions to either Geoff or I. We would be very happy to share. We'll give that, 9 or 10 minutes, and then we will get to our panel. Maybe a little less.
Maybe we should let the experts speak.
This is what we call in education wait time. You're supposed to teach, you're supposed to wait for 30 seconds, because in 30 seconds, someone in the crowd will become uncomfortable enough to volunteer to speak. And I often make my teachers, fellow teachers are probably laughing at this, but I often make my teachers sit and pay attention for 30 seconds just in silence, because 30 seconds is an excruciating long time to spend in a group. But I agree with Geoff, if there are no questions. We have 4 panelists here today. We're going to go in the order that you were on this list. And Betsy, if you want to add anything to your bio, I got a little bit more bio information from Muriel and Sarah, but I did not get more from Betsy or John. So Betsy and John, please feel free to add your own additional information. And they're going to share a little bit about their experiences. So Betsy, would you like to kick us off?
Sure, I will start since I may have the younger or youngest grandchildren. So I'd like to start by saying that there's nothing that brings me more joy than being an active, participating grandparent. So I adore my 4 grandsons. They are currently 5 years old, 14 months twins, and a 3-week-old just born during the pandemic. I have spent much of the past 5 years babysitting, holding them, and hugging them. They spend a lot of time at our house. We moved down the street from my older daughter, who has the 5-year-old, and we moved to New Jersey to be nearby, so I wasn't commuting from Pennsylvania. And I spend a lot of time reading to them, and we sing together. And it's very important for me to carry on our family traditions. Not only do I want to help my 2 daughters, but I want my grandchildren to know that they have unconditional love and a welcome place in our home and at our table, much as I felt with my maternal grandparents. For example, my 5-year-old grandson, Mo, says, Pop's restaurant is never closed. So my husband does all the cooking. So he always loves to eat at Pop's restaurant. And he thinks, and every time he comes to our house, he says, this is absolutely delicious. I need to have several more portions and I need some to take home for tomorrow. So needless to say, for the last 3 or 4 weeks, he's been eating at our house almost every night because it's better than Sabrina's, he says. Anyway, so when my first grandson was born, they asked me what name should they call me? And the other grandmother was Grandma. And so I had an obsession with Bibi Neuwirth, and so I didn't want to be Bubby. So I said, I'm going to be Bibi. I'm a retired pediatrician, but I'm probably a frustrated, uptight psychiatrist like Dr. Lilith was on maybe Geoff and maybe Gabe may be too young for this, but on Cheers and Frasier, for those in my generation might remember, Dr. Lilith Sternin. Anyway, so they call me Bibi, and actually this name has stuck. So my kids call me Mom or Bibi now, actually. So in any case, the COVID pandemic has changed the way we have interacted over these last 6 months. What was once a no-brainer, because we'd be at Pop's house for dinner, I would be there almost every day, is now fraught with all sorts of questions. There is not a clear path to take, and each situation is different. grandparenting in the time of COVID is not a one-size-fits-all. We are navigating a constantly changing terrain, weighing the risks and benefits. So way back in March, which seems like ages ago, when we had little knowledge and a higher viral load in our community, we operated to a large extent out of fear. And isolation was our initial modus operandi. I really did not see my grandchildren at all for, I would say, a good 2+ months. We saw each other virtually. Now, this was an almost 5-year-old, and they were 9-month-old twins at the time. Didn't work so well on a virtual modality because they didn't want to stay in front of the screen. Yes, we could read a book, or yes, we could sing, but they would be crawling away, or they would be, losing interest. It was difficult. The medium of the being on FaceTime or Zoom or something like that, it wasn't as gratifying, not for me or for them. So what we ended up doing was we gradually morphed into drive-by visits where my daughters would hold them outside the car and we would wave. And then we went from that to, or my 5-year-old, almost 5-year-old at the time, grandson would stand outside and we would wave to him from the porch. And then we went to backyard and porch visits. And so it was interesting for this, this smorgasbord of interaction that we went through, that we didn't lose more of the bond. I was amazed that we had so much resilience in our relationship that that was very interesting. Our relationship was maintained even with 9-month-olds who now are 14-month-old, that they didn't lose, even wearing a mask, they didn't lose when they heard my voice. They right away put their arms out for me to pick them up. The hardest thing for me was when they put their arms out and I couldn't pick them up and I couldn't touch them. So for about another month or so after that, first 2 months when I didn't see them at all, except virtually, when I did see them, I did not touch them. And so wanting to hug them or hold them was just really, really hard for me. I had been basically with them, holding them, taking care of them, snuggling them. It was just, I had to put restraints on myself not to, go be close to them. And so that was very, very hard. But still, we had gained this resilience. And so way back in March, when we had this little knowledge and the higher viral load, we operated out of this fear. But we learned over these last few months what we needed to do to maintain a decent amount of contact and some fulfilling interaction with some safety precautions in place. So trying to socially distance, which we did. My 5-year-old grandson would say to me, stand back. If he would be delivering a package, he'd say, Bibi, stand back. He said, is my mask on straight? If my mask is on straight, you can pick up the package and then stand 3 steps back. He would be very precise in how he would tell me to pick up the package. And
sorry, Betsy, I just want to give you your 1-minute warning.
Okay. And then I would disinfect, and all that. So in any case, my daughters, it was very, very nice because they wanted us to visit all the time, at least weekly. And we were providing comfort for that generation as well because they were isolated too and working at home. So it was really nice to be wanted and needed. And so for the last 2 months, though, I have been back to babysitting, holding and doing small hugs. I have to put restraints on myself. We sing Shabbat Shalom, we sing Zoom Gali Gali, and we have this new baby now. So we sing, don't pee on BB, don't pee on BB, don't pee on BB, don't pee on BB. And then we make up each of the lines of the song, and we do all of this various thing. But my 14-month-olds are They hurl the lamp off the side of the table. They jump on our treadmill, jump off the treadmill. They are bench pressing the toys that we have. Anything that is not a baby toy, they will go for, like a cell phone, or anything is fair game for them. So we have to be very careful. But what I wanted to say is that as the season gets into sixth season, we're going to have a lot more care that we have to take. But I want to say that being grateful for what we have is what is important to me. And as we read Psalm 27 during Elul, the Echat Shahalti comes to mind. I am asking God one question. In the words of Rabbi Deborah Robbins, quote, "My prayer turns toward gratitude. Thank you, generosity, for the abundance in my life. Thank you, protection, for keeping us alive and allowing us to reach this moment. If I could ask God for only one thing, what would it be? The one thing I would ask is, how can I help?"
Thank you so much, Betsy. All right, we're going to hand it off to Muriel.
I'll try to talk fast. Good afternoon. This pandemic has certainly impacted my relationships with my local granddaughters. And of course, many of you know they're teenagers. There were several events we had to revisit this spring, in the spring. Shira turned 16 in April. I was not going to participate in her planned event, which makes sense. I don't think 16-year-olds have. However, Ari, her younger sister, baked her.
Muriel, the microphone slipped again.
So, can you hear me now?
Yep.
All right. Ari, her younger sister, baked her a really beautiful cake. I don't know if Candace has the photo of the round cake with the green. Well, maybe not. Shira and her dad ended up driving by my building and dropping off a piece of that cake, which, can you show the inside of it? Well, I'll keep going. So Shira's confirmation was in May, and though the synagogue created a really beautiful recorded confirmation, we couldn't have a celebratory event. I did love seeing the synagogue. They brought up all these recordings of the kids over the years. They could not have done that if the event was in the synagogue. So
Mike again, Muriel. Sorry.
You can't hear me?
Yeah, lift up the computer again. I think something when you shifted.
All right. So
Perfect.
Okay. Now, all right. So Ari's another event. Ari's 8th grade graduation and my birthday coincided. Essentially, my birthday was the day before her graduation. So we would have gone out for a special dinner. Ari was giving a graduation address. However, that couldn't happen. So this was the first time I saw them. Now that's June already. I saw them. I went to their home. We sat with masks on. We watched the graduation. Ari baked me a birthday cake to add to the celebration. That's the yellow cake, Candace, if you can bring it up. Well, maybe not. So one of my favorite things in the summer is to go to the University City Swim Club. And we all belong. We don't go there necessarily together. That's my cake. Isn't that beautiful? But the swim club was a place I could see the girls. So since that wasn't going to happen, and the girls and their parents could not pursue the vacation they had planned, which involved flying. They decided to go somewhere where they could drive. And I got invited. So we went to the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and I lived with them for 8 days along with the dog. I mean, so, you know, this was really delightful. The dog is Eliza. Basically, the COVID has been a mixed bag for me, for us. The girls have connected with me using FaceTime, and they're good at it. They call me, they take me on tours of their house. I get to see the dog, I get to see the cats. Shira painted the walls of their basement bathroom. It's done in polygons. It's really beautiful. So I got to see that. And yeah, the things, but what Shira told me is that we really see more of each other because we're FaceTiming, which is kind of interesting. I mean, they weren't in school, they weren't in school buildings, and they had time, like to call me, to chat with me.
Muriel, I'm giving you your time warning here.
All right, so the other thing, I miss their sporting events. Ordinarily, I'd go to see ice hockey games. Shira plays ice hockey. I'd go to see tennis matches. This may happen again soon. And the other thing is, I would always, when we had Sunday seminars at the synagogue, they were going into religious school. I'd get to the synagogue really early so I could say hello to them. They proceeded to school, and I got to my seminars. And that's what's happening. Okay. I can answer questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you,
welcome.
Muriel. We will do questions at the end. We appreciate it. And Sarah is up next. Unmute, please, Sarah.
Okay, for this presentation, I'm Mimi rather than Sarah, which all 5 of my grandchildren call me. 3 live in the Philly suburbs and 2 live in Virginia. First, I'll share with you what my Philadelphia adventure's been like. Prior to COVID, every Wednesday, I would pick up my 2 oldest grandchildren at school, and we celebrated what we dubbed Silly Willy Backwards Wednesday. The kids would come home from school, take a shower, put on their pajamas, eat dessert, that was the feature, and then eat dinner. Afterward, they would immerse themselves in their bedtime routines. This past February, before any mention of quarantine, I moved into my son's house in the suburbs to help take care of my grandkids while their parents were out of town. I had packed for the weekend, although not enough clothes for my extended stay of 6 months. Silly Willy Wednesday continued, along with my elevation to mistress of homeschooling. I should take a minute to mention that I was happy to call on my professional experience as a bench scientist and subsequently a science curriculum specialist and educator. Candace, if you want to put up the first picture entitled Corona. Thank you. Thank you. Consequently, the first day of homeschooling after our morning circle time where we said the pledge and established ground rules, we had a lesson where I explained to my 3, 7, and 9-year-old students, AKA grandchildren, how viruses are transmitted with more specific information about the coronavirus. So on the screen is a picture created by the 7-year-old depicting viral transmission. On the back, he wrote his disdain, that's my word, not his, of the virus because he couldn't go to school. Little did we know that there would be no more school in person for the rest of the year. A personalized daily schedule became the anchor for each of my grandchildren as they zoomed their way through the next 15 weeks of school. I had been interacting with their teachers throughout homeschooling, and at the end, I wrote a personal letter to each of the teachers expressing my gratitude for their, what really were Herculean efforts throughout the entire quarantine. On another note, as many experienced, there were no haircuts or stylist visits for several months. So I started exploring alternatives to keep my hair in order. Picture this. One evening I appeared at dinner wearing a silverish wig. My 3-year-old grandson said, "Mimi, you look just like Grammy," AKA my 98-year-old mother, who was living nearby in a senior community. And my 7-year-old grandson said, "You look like this singer who sang on TV last night," AKA Kristen Chenoweth. Two very different lenses initiated a gale of nonstop laughter from everyone at the table. And cultivating our senses of humor was a very, very important element of our quarantine time together. So Passover rolled around, and my son and his family traditionally go to Florida to have Passover with my daughter-in-law's extended family, and that wasn't happening this year. So together with the kids, we turned the whole house over and made it what my mother would have called pace-a-deck, with changing dishes and shelves and cleaning from top to bottom. The kids really got involved in everything, including making their own Seder. They decided they wanted to lead this second night Seder. Candace, if you could put up that second picture, please. So on the screen now is a photograph of the pictures at the top that my 7-year-old grandson drew. And underneath is this script that my 9-year-old granddaughter typed along with my notes, cueing who would have various parts on the extravaganza. Actually, the way it turned out, you would have thought that the kids had had 4 glasses of wine, because there was a lot of merriment and celebrating going on. Toward the last week of our homeschooling, we planned an end of the year assembly. And after reciting and the pledge and Hatikva each morning for several months during our homeschooling, everyone, including myself, was surprised to hear that 3-year-old Parker had learned both, and he led those in our end of the year assembly. For me, the whole period was an extraordinary time where I could intertwine my love of science, education, and of course, my grandchildren. During the quarantine, each of my daughters-in-law expressed concern about how their kids would manage during this time. And my response to them was that as long as they know that they're loved and that the adults in their life are calm, they will evolve in a positive way. And that seems to have borne true thus far. My Virginia grandchildren.
Sorry, I'm just giving you your time.
Okay, thank you. My Virginia grandchildren turned 3 and 5 during the quarantine, and my interactions with them, due to proximity, were very different and much more challenging in some ways. Thank goodness for Amazon and FaceTime, because we would have hour-long reading sessions, and the next day they would get the book that we had read from Amazon. And to maintain a positive presence in their lives, I sent them books and letters and cards every week, which helped me maintain contact with them. Just in sum, between my mother and my kids and my grandkids, I learned that grandparenting, parenting, great-grandparenting were all interwoven and continue to be during this time. Coupled with cooking and reading and going on hikes, honing our senses of humor, and many more tangible and intangible discoveries. It really has been a very special time for all of us. And although my son said nobody's really interested in seeing pictures of your grandchildren, they only want to see their own. Candace, if you would like do a 5-second flash of each of the that's the Virginia crew up on the screen now. And then if you would do the Philly crew next, please.
All right, thank you, Sarah. I have to cut you off.
Okay.
John.
All right, thank
John, so audience, we are at our actual hour. We had intended to keep this open for 15 minutes. I actually have time, so I am willing to stay on a little even up. Oh no, we may have to give up the Zoom link at that point, so it may be moved. But if there's some other way we can hang out, certainly we have 15 minutes, but let's let John talk And
We
then
should have time for Zoom to stay on.
Oh, we can? All right, then I'm
Yeah.
happy to stay on with folks after. John, please.
Sure. So my story maybe is a little bit different. So I retired at the end of last year after 31 years working for my company, Conrail, as a lawyer. So we had no grandchildren at that time. My daughter was pregnant. So I was sort of getting used to being retired. My wife was still working. You know, our granddaughter, Ella, is a true pandemic baby. She was born 10 days before the lockdown. So we were very fortunate in that. She was very lucky in that sense. And I still remember being in Pennsylvania Hospital when she was born, and the maternity nurse is telling us, "Oh, I wouldn't worry about this virus. I don't think it'll be anything." You know, the next week, fortunately, my wife had taken off, and we still were not in the lockdown. So she was able to spend that first week with my daughter and the baby, really trying to help her out, you know, that first week and everything. And frankly, we were all trying to just relearn having a baby again. It's been, you know, 25 years since we were dealing with anything like this. And the rules and the guidelines on babies have changed radically over the last 30 years about what you can and can't do. So we had to sort of like learn all this stuff. And of course, we're looking at each other, we never did any of that stuff and you turned out fine. What's that all about? But, you know, then the lockdown comes and, you know, the first, you know, really month or two was sort of kind of like what Judy was talking about. You're trying to navigate what's the risk, what's going on. Nobody's really quite sure what to do. So we would go out once a week, really just to help our daughter. I mean, the good part of it is her husband, who's and both my daughter and son-in-law are lawyers as well, as is my wife. You know, he would have been back at work pretty quickly at that point. So it was sort of a blessing. He ended up being home for 2 or 3 months. To really help out at that stage. And, you know, we're trying to figure it out. And then we had all these kind of complicated COVID issues where my daughter's mother-in-law is a nurse at a senior citizen home, you know, early on that had 60 or 70 cases of the virus. About a week after we had last seen my wife's sisters, they both got the virus. And my son-in-law's father is a doctor at a hospital in New Jersey that had tons of COVID cases, and they were trying to figure out, could they see each other? Could they not see each other? So, you know, the first couple of months, it was a lot of that. And then, you know, what happened after that is when we went to yellow, my son-in-law decided to go back to work because he worked in a law office where he was basically the only person in there, at which point my daughter was alone for the first time. So she started coming down to our condo in Center City. They live up in Mount Airy a couple of days a week, so we could help with the baby as much as we could. You know, really, I mean, it was a joy because we really got to see, you know, almost day-to-day development. You forget how quickly babies at that age change. I mean, literally every week they're changing a tremendous amount. So, I mean, it really was a blessing to be able to do that and to help her out. She was very, yeah, we all remember that first baby is very stressful. You don't know what you're doing. You think you're killing the baby all the time. You have no idea what to do. So we were able to really, I think, calm her down and relax her, say, no, this is okay. This is normal. This is fine. And then what happened was her leave ended about 2.5 weeks ago. And at that time, you know, they had decided they were going to put the baby actually in a Jewish daycare center out at BTBJ, Beth Tikva, Beth Israel, which is a shul out in Springfield, a conservative synagogue near where they live. But they couldn't take the baby for the first week and a half. So my wife and my daughter were sitting at the dining room table working with each other with their computers, all three of us trying to deal with the babies as much as we can. Here it is. This was, I think, the second day that they were down there. This is sort of what it looked like at that time. And, you know, we sort of figured it out as much as we could. You know, one of the things, you know, that I've been doing, and any of you who are Facebook friends with me know I've literally put a new picture of Ella up every day on Facebook, and frankly, it's therapeutic for all of us, and frankly, for my Facebook friends. If I don't put a picture of her up every day, they get very upset. And Candace, you could put up the other picture, you'll see why, because all she does is smile. She's the happiest baby I've ever seen. And she's really a ray of sunshine. And it's been great, you know, in 6 months, which goes like this, you know, she's literally, you know, gone from, you know, this blob to she's actually sort of crawling already at this point. And we're feeding her real food and all of this wonderful stuff, which has been great. You know, we don't have the relationship and all the structure, of course, that everybody else was talking about, because she's too little for any of that. And I sent one more picture, which I'll end my discussion with it now. If you can get that up, I just sent it to you, Candace. Anyway, it's her first Shabbat at BTBJ with the rabbis who come out, because it works similar to our daycare center at RS as well. But it's really been a journey and very complicated for all of us, but it's been a real blessing in many ways. So that's my spiel.
Thank you so much, John. I really just want to first thank John and Sarah and Muriel and Betsy. It was really, I mean, it was amazing for me to hear from you, obviously looking at the world from a different slice of life. And I'm sure everyone else really appreciated it. And also thank you so much, Geoff, also hugely educated for me, and I'm sure also for the audience. At this point, we have a little bit of time where I'm certainly happy to stay on. Panelists, I don't know how much time you have, but whoever can stay on is sort of welcome to stay on. And if folks want to come off mute and share or ask questions, please feel free. Or put them in the chat.
I also sort of introduced it as a good idea to have sort of like a practice run. Not like this has some things that I want, like the piano being turned around, but like this doesn't have to be like the last time, but like we'll, you know, learn things while we're moving it, like how exactly, you know, how long it really is and how you.
Right, I'm gonna close this because I don't need to stay.
That was interesting.
Getting ready for tonight, probably.
Got it. Sorry, I couldn't quite figure out what was going on there. Was there someone who was trying to speak earlier?
Oh, I don't know.
Somebody, sorry, Shelley put in chat, would love anyone to share long distance grandparenting with a 15-month-old. So sort of in the same time frame, a little bit later time frame than John was talking about. But if anybody wants to share about that sort of experience, there's a request.
I can comment on that. I lived in Wisconsin when my older grandchildren were in that age range, and we did similar things on FaceTime. We would read poems, very short poems and picture books, and my grandkids had the same book with them, and their parents were holding them. And I would have the book and be reading, and it was just a shorter experience, but that was a really nice way to connect with them.
Thank you, thank you. I'm the paternal grandmother, and I always worried that I would have a granddaughter that didn't take me into account, not a granddaughter, a daughter-in-law, sorry. But I'm so grateful. My daughter-in-law FaceTimes us almost every day.
That's great.
And it's wonderful. But I used to go up there in Brooklyn, and I don't know when I saw them once since February, actually.
It's hard.
Yeah.
So I had a question for Geoff, which was, you know, psychologically, what impact do you feel like COVID is going to have on some of these kids with sort of these disrupted relationships? And, you know, similarly for you, Gabe, you know, in terms of the school disruption, I mean, I know it's very early in the process, but what do people think the impact might be, or things to look for?
It's a great question. I think no one knows the answers. There's certainly other sort of, pandemics or significant incidents that one can look to model. But again, they're all a bit distinct. I actually would say this. I think I tend to perhaps value the resiliency of children in scenarios like this. And so I think there's great capacity to adapt. I also think many of us are very privileged and lucky to live in environments where the strains are not as significant as others. So, a lot of the pressures that you're seeing, and this really is like an epidemic that is, it's essentially like a stress disorder. It's keeping people in their homes, the traditional outlets of play, of socialization, of school are not there. And so it's kind of like an ongoing stress test. And unfortunately, if you read the literature, you'll see things like, increased domestic violence, increased reports of child abuse, increased all sorts of really tragic outcomes. Although I'll add to that, there are also disparities, both socioeconomically and racially, in terms of who's getting most impacted by that. So I'm going to stay optimistic about the long-term impact. And I'll say that hearing the panelists, including you, just the way you've talked about, the joy, the pleasure, the experience, and just the love that's present in all these relationships leaves me feeling much more optimistic about the sort of long-term impact on this.
Other folks with questions?
I couldn't tell if that was the optimistic picture of like vacation.
I would just add that we find universally that young people are really resilient, and that what they most need are whole, healthy adults in their lives, and that they can survive all sorts of things when they have whole, healthy adults in their lives. So the more that you can be a whole, healthy adult in the life of a child, the better that child is going to be.
I have something to add.
Please.
Every night I have a FaceTime dinner with my 2.5-year-old grandson in California. We compare what's on my plate and what's on his plate. And it's really very funny because he's a vegetarian, so he's never seen half the things that are on my plate. But it's fun. He also has a new plant, and he sings to it every night. So he saves the song until I'm on the phone, and I get to hear a song to the plant every night. So that's really become a highlight of my day since I can't get there to see him.
And to some extent, I think the opportunity in crisis here can sometimes get lost, right? Like that might never have happened in a non-quarantine world, right? Some of our quarantine experiences, some of the relationships, certainly I've seen between my own parents and my in-laws and my children, have really blossomed when they've been talking on the phone. Like my 12-year-old who wanders around the house talking on the phone to her grandmother. I mean, that didn't happen before this started.
That's very true. My daughter never called me, maybe once every month, and now she calls every night so that she can get a break during dinner and I can talk to Jonah instead during dinner. So it's become a nightly thing instead of a monthly thing. So that's a real plus.
And so FaceTime, my daughter calls me, she FaceTimes me frequently, and my granddaughters are wandering around in back of her. So it's really wonderful. I wouldn't have that experience in normal times. It's a result of COVID.
One other thing I'd like to mention is that my 7-year-old grandson and I play chess when we're not together digitally. He invites me to play digital chess, and we play chess together. Also, there is an app called Messenger Kids, which is an offshoot of Facebook. And my kids, my grandkids set up groups with different permutations of the family. So we play games on that, and they can video chat with me that way. So there's some other opportunities digitally that are more at their level, and the chess is really fun. And believe me, he is a tough opponent.
If you are a player of board games, there are a number of online board game sites now, including a site called Steam, that allow you to play a whole bunch of different board games online.
Yeah, I actually just downloaded Steam last night. There's
What kind
so
of
many
age
things.
group
They
is
have
that appropriate
tabletop
for?
that you
It's
can do a
amazing. I
tabletop
mean, the number of
simulator.
games.
What kind of age group are the games for?
I think they range from any age almost. I mean, probably not super young, but
Nothing I can do for a 2.5-year-old, I don't think.
that might be tough.
Right.
No, but the games that have whiteboards involved in them that 2.5-year-olds might like. So Sarah was talking about, what was it?
Messenger Kids.
Messenger Kids. There's a number of them, and I think Zoom has a platform for this, but I haven't played with it, that have whiteboard features. And the moment you have a white space that you can draw in, and your picture and your grandchild's picture, right, you can kind of have a whole set of games that can be played. Tic-tac-toe can be played, right? Just Hangman or Pictionary or games like that can be played, right, like this.
That's great. So I can check it out. Thank you. Love it. Good picture, Candace.
Well, as your super Uber host, I'd say we need to wrap it up. I personally want to thank everybody for this. Thanks, Gabe.
Thank you.
Bye, Gail.
Thank you all so